The morning bells of Westminster chimed 7 times when the black-draped announcement appeared on the palace gates. Margaret Sullivan, a seasoned royal correspondent for the London Herald, arrived at Buckingham Palace expecting another routine day of covering minor royal engagements. Instead, she found herself staring at an official proclamation that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. The gold-embossed paper bore the royal seal, its crimson wax still fresh. The message was brief yet earth-shattering. By royal decree, the court announces a period of official mourning. All flags shall fly at half-mast. The funeral service will be held in 3 days' time at Westminster Abbey. What the announcement failed to mention was who had died. Margaret's journalistic instincts kicked into overdrive. In her 23 years covering the royal family, she had never encountered anything quite like this. Royal deaths were monumental events, meticulously planned and announced with great ceremony. The deceased's name, their contributions to the crown, and detailed funeral arrangements were always included. This announcement felt like a puzzle missing its most crucial pieces. She quickly dialed her editor, James Whitmore, who answered on the first ring. His voice carried the excitement of someone who sensed a major story brewing. "Margaret, please tell me you're seeing what I think you're seeing," James said, barely containing his enthusiasm. "I'm standing right in front of it. The announcement went up 20 minutes ago, and already there's a crowd forming. James, I've covered every royal funeral since Princess Diana's, and I've never seen anything like this. No name, no details, nothing. Any word from your palace contacts?" Margaret glanced around the growing crowd of confused tourists and equally puzzled reporters. "I've been trying to reach Lady Catherine Pemberton all morning. She's been the palace's unofficial spokesperson for years, but her phone goes straight to voicemail. Same with Sir Thomas Ainsworth from the Lord Chamberlain's office. It's like they've all vanished." The crowd outside the palace gates swelled as word spread through London's morning rush hour. Commuters stopped on their way to work, pulling out their phones to capture images of the mysterious announcement. Social media exploded with theories and speculation, but official channels remained eerily silent. Dr. Eleanor Harwick, a constitutional law professor at Oxford University, pushed through the crowd to get a closer look at the announcement. Her area of expertise was royal protocol, and this situation violated every precedent she knew. In her scholarly opinion, this level of secrecy around a royal death was unprecedented in modern times. "Excuse me," she said, approaching Margaret, whose press badge identified her as someone who might have answers. "I'm Dr. Harwick from Oxford. I've studied royal protocol for 30 years, and I'm completely baffled. Have you heard anything from your sources?" Margaret shook her head. Complete silence. It's as if the entire palace staff has been sworn to secrecy or disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, inside the palace walls, a different drama was unfolding. Sarah Collins, a junior member of the household staff, hurried through the marble corridors carrying fresh linens. She had worked at the palace for 3 years and prided herself on knowing the daily routines of every senior royal family member. Yet this morning, everything felt different. The Queen's private quarters showed no signs of distress or mourning preparations. Prince Charles had been seen earlier in the morning reviewing documents in his study, appearing entirely normal. Prince William had departed for his scheduled environmental summit in Scotland the previous evening. Princess Anne was known to be at her country estate in Gloucestershire, tending to her horses as she did every Tuesday morning. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong with the entire situation. Palace staff were typically informed of major developments well in advance, especially something as significant as a death in the royal family. Yet no internal memos had circulated, no emergency meetings had been called, and the normal protocols for royal mourning had not been activated. She paused outside the blue drawing room when she heard hushed voices from within. Through the slightly ajar door, she could see 2 figures she didn't recognize. a tall man in an expensive suit, and a woman with silver hair dressed entirely in black. They spoke in urgent whispers, their conversation too quiet to understand, but their body language suggesting extreme urgency. "The announcement has been made," the woman said, her voice barely audible. "And you're certain this is the only way?" the man replied. "There's no alternative. The truth would be far more damaging than this temporary confusion." Sarah's heart raced. She knew she shouldn't be eavesdropping, but something about this conversation felt connected to the mysterious Mourning announcement. Before she could hear more, footsteps echoed down the corridor behind her. She quickly continued with her duties, but the overheard conversation haunted her thoughts. Back outside the palace, the crowd had grown to several hundred people. News crews from every major network had arrived, their satellite trucks lining the streets. The lack of information only fueled more intense speculation. Some theorized that the Queen herself had passed away and the palace was managing the announcement carefully. Others suggested it might be Prince Philip, though he had been seen just 2 weeks earlier at a public engagement. Margaret noticed a familiar figure approaching through the crowd, Inspector David Morrison from Scotland Yard's Royal Protection Unit. She had developed a professional relationship with him over the years, and his presence suggested this situation had escalated beyond simple palace protocol. "Inspector Morrison," she called out, weaving through the crowd to reach him. "Any official word on what's happening here?" Morrison's expression was unreadable, but Margaret caught a hint of confusion in his eyes. "I'm afraid I can't comment on ongoing palace matters, Ms. Sullivan, but I will say that this situation is unusual." "Unusual how?" "In my 15 years protecting the royal family, I've never encountered a security situation quite like this one. We've been asked to maintain standard protocols without being informed of the specific threat or circumstances we're protecting against." This revelation sent a chill down Margaret's spine. If Scotland Yard's Royal Protection Unit was operating blind, then whatever was happening at the palace went far beyond normal royal procedures. As the afternoon wore on, the absence of information became a story in itself. International media outlets picked up the mystery, with headlines appearing across Europe and America asking the same question: who died at Buckingham Palace? The Archbishop of Canterbury's office released a brief statement confirming they had been asked to prepare Westminster Abbey for a funeral service, but they too had not been informed of the deceased's identity. The funeral directors who typically handled royal ceremonies reported receiving no contact from the palace. Dr. Harwick spent the day researching historical precedents, hoping to find some explanation for the unprecedented secrecy. She discovered that during World War II, certain royal movements had been kept secret for security reasons, but never a death announcement. The closest parallel she could find was the delayed announcement of King George VI's death in 1952, but even then, the delay was only a matter of hours, not the complete absence of identity seen today. As evening approached, Margaret decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing on who had died, she began investigating who was still alive. She started making calls to every contact she had cultivated over the years, seeking confirmation that specific royal family members were still breathing. Her first call was to a reliable source at the royal stables. "Can you confirm that Princess Anne was seen this morning?" "Absolutely. She was here at 6:30 sharp, same as always. Spent 2 hours with her horses before heading back to the main house for breakfast." Her second call went to a contact at the Environmental Summit in Scotland. "Prince William is definitely here. He gave a speech this morning about climate change initiatives and has been meeting with delegates all day." One by one, Margaret confirmed the whereabouts and well-being of every immediate member of the royal family. The Queen had been seen taking her morning tea. Prince Charles had held his regular Tuesday briefing with his private secretary. Prince Harry was confirmed to be in California with his family. Even the more distant relatives seemed to be accounted for. This led Margaret to a disturbing conclusion. If everyone in the royal family was alive and well, then who exactly was the palace mourning? As night fell over London, the mystery deepened. The palace gates remained locked, with no additional statements forthcoming. The crowd outside had thinned, but not disappeared, with die-hard royal watchers maintaining their vigil, hoping for any new development. Margaret filed her evening report with a growing sense that she was covering something far more complex than a simple royal death. The pieces of this puzzle didn't fit together in any way that made sense according to traditional royal protocol. In her hotel room that night, she spread out everything she had gathered during the day: photographs of the announcement, notes from her conversations with various sources, timelines of royal family member movements, and historical research provided by Dr. Harwick. Something was happening at Buckingham Palace that defied explanation. The announcement of mourning without identifying the deceased suggested either an unprecedented level of palace incompetence, which seemed highly unlikely given their centuries of protocol experience, or something far more calculated and mysterious. As she prepared for bed, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or you'll discover more than you bargained for." The message sent a chill through her body. In 23 years of royal reporting, she had never received anything that could be considered a threat. Whatever was happening at the palace, someone desperately wanted the truth to remain hidden. Margaret stared out her hotel window at the illuminated palace in the distance, its flags flying at half-mast for someone whose identity remained a complete mystery. Tomorrow, she decided, she would dig deeper, regardless of who wanted her to stop. The palace had announced mourning, but the deceased remained a mystery that was beginning to feel like something much more dangerous than simple royal protocol confusion. Margaret woke before dawn with the threatening text message still fresh in her mind. The mysterious warning had only strengthened her resolve to uncover the truth behind the palace's unprecedented announcement. She dressed quickly and headed back to Buckingham Palace, where she found the scene even more surreal than the previous day. The palace grounds were now surrounded by temporary barriers, and the number of security personnel had tripled overnight. Royal protection officers stood at attention every few meters, their faces stern and watchful. This level of security response typically accompanied visits from foreign heads of state or major royal events, not funeral preparations. Dr. Harwick was already there, clutching a thick folder of research materials. She approached Margaret with obvious excitement and concern. "I've been up all night researching this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I found something that might explain the secrecy, but it raises even more disturbing questions." Margaret pulled out her notebook, ready to capture every detail. "What did you find?" "In 1936, during King Edward VIII's abdication crisis, the palace used a similar pattern of mysterious announcements to manage public perception. They would release vague statements about significant developments without providing specifics, allowing them to control the narrative before revealing the full truth." "So you think this is some kind of cover-up?" "Possibly. But the abdication involved a living royal family member making a choice. Death announcements are different. There's usually no strategic reason to hide the identity of the deceased unless—" Dr. Harwick paused, her academic composure faltering slightly. "Unless what?" "Unless the circumstances of the death are so scandalous or politically sensitive that revealing them would damage the monarchy itself." This theory sent Margaret's journalistic instincts into overdrive. She began mentally cataloging recent royal activities, looking for any situation that might have created such sensitive circumstances. Her thoughts were interrupted when Sarah Collins, the palace staff member she had noticed the previous day, approached them nervously. "Excuse me," Sarah said, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "You're the reporter from the Herald, right? I work inside the palace, and I think something terrible is happening." Margaret introduced herself and Dr. Harwick, sensing that Sarah might be the breakthrough they needed. "Yesterday morning, I overheard a conversation between two people I didn't recognize," Sarah continued. "They were talking about the announcement being necessary to prevent something much worse from coming to light. Can you describe these people?" A tall man in an expensive suit and a woman with silver hair, both dressed in black. They were in the blue drawing room, and they seemed to know each other well. The woman said that the truth would be far more damaging than the current confusion. Dr. Harwick exchanged a meaningful glance with Margaret. "Sarah, have you noticed anything else unusual in the past few days? Any changes in routine, unexpected visitors, unusual meetings?" Sarah nodded emphatically. 3 days ago, a group of men in dark suits arrived at the palace. They weren't announced, and they didn't go through normal security procedures. They were escorted directly to the Queen's private study, and they stayed for over 3 hours. Did you recognize any of them? No, but one of the housekeepers mentioned they were from some government department. She didn't know which one. Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. Government officials meeting secretly with the Queen, followed by a mysterious death announcement, suggested connections far beyond normal royal affairs. She decided to pursue a different angle of investigation. "Sarah, I need to ask you something that might sound strange. In the past week, has anyone at the palace seemed different, stressed, absent, or behaving unusually?" Sarah considered this carefully. "Now that you mention it, Lady Catherine Pemberton hasn't been seen since Monday. She usually has meetings every day with various staff members, but her office has been locked, and her assistant says she's unavailable." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Lady Catherine was her primary palace contact, and her sudden disappearance seemed more than coincidental. "What about Sir Thomas Ainsworth?" "He's been having closed-door meetings all week. His secretary mentioned that he's been working on sensitive matters that require complete discretion." The pieces were beginning to form a disturbing picture. Key palace officials were either missing or operating under unusual secrecy protocols, while the royal family themselves appeared to be continuing their normal activities. Margaret decided to test a theory. She asked Sarah to help her identify which staff members had access to specific areas of the palace and when they had last been seen. What emerged was a pattern that defied logical explanation. All the senior staff members who typically handled royal protocol and public communications had either disappeared or become suddenly unavailable starting 3 days ago. Meanwhile, junior staff like Sarah were continuing their normal duties, but being kept completely in the dark about any special circumstances. Dr. Harwick was furiously taking notes as Sarah provided details. "This suggests a very carefully orchestrated information control operation," she observed. "Someone is managing this situation with military precision." Their conversation was interrupted when Inspector Morrison appeared, his expression more troubled than the previous day. "Miss Sullivan," he said, approaching their group, "I need to ask you to step back from the palace grounds." "Is there a security threat?" "I can't discuss specifics, but I've been instructed to maintain a wider perimeter around the palace. All non-essential personnel need to move to the other side of the street." Margaret sensed this was more than routine security protocol. "Inspector, can you at least confirm whether the royal family is safe?" Morrison hesitated for a moment too long before answering. "The royal family is secure." The careful phrasing of his response, secure rather than safe, suggested a distinction that made Margaret increasingly uneasy. As they moved across the street, Sarah whispered urgently, "There's something else. This morning, I saw funeral preparations being made in the palace chapel, but they weren't the normal preparations. Usually, funeral arrangements involve specific protocols depending on the rank and status of the deceased. These preparations looked generic, as if they didn't know who they were burying." Dr. Harwick stopped walking abruptly. "That's impossible. Royal funeral protocols are among the most detailed and specific procedures in the monarchy. Every aspect depends on the exact identity and status of the deceased. Exactly, Sarah replied. Which is why it was so strange. They were setting up for a funeral without knowing who it was for. Margaret pulled out her phone and called James at the Herald. I need you to investigate something for me. Check with your contacts at Westminster Abbey. Find out exactly what kind of funeral preparations they're making and whether they've been given any specific details about the deceased. While waiting for James to call back, Margaret decided to test another theory. She called her contact at Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, knowing they often received advance notice when preparing exhibitions related to recently deceased public figures. David, it's Margaret from the Herald. Have you received any requests to prepare memorial displays for royal family members? That's odd you should ask. We received a very strange call yesterday from someone claiming to represent the palace. They asked about our procedures for memorial displays, but wouldn't specify who the display would honor. When we asked for details, they hung up. This added another layer to the mystery. Even businesses that typically supported royal commemorations were being kept in the dark about the identity of the deceased. James called back 20 minutes later with information that deepened the puzzle further. Margaret, I spoke with 3 different contacts at Westminster Abbey. They've been asked to prepare for a funeral service, but here's the strange part. They've been given conflicting information about almost every detail. One department was told to prepare for a state funeral, another was told it would be a private family service, and the third was told it might be a memorial service rather than a funeral. That makes no sense. Abbey funeral preparations are always precisely coordinated. It gets stranger. The Dean of Westminster told my contact that he's never encountered a situation where the palace has been so unclear about funeral arrangements. Usually they provide detailed specifications months in advance for major royal events. Margaret hung up feeling more confused than ever. Every lead seemed to generate more questions rather than answers. The pattern emerging suggested either complete incompetence at the highest levels of palace administration, which seemed impossible, or a deliberate strategy to create confusion and uncertainty. Dr. Harwick had been quietly reviewing her research notes while Margaret made her calls. I think I understand what might be happening, she said suddenly. This could be what intelligence agencies call a controlled disclosure operation. Meaning what? Instead of hiding information completely, you create so much conflicting and confusing information that the truth becomes impossible to distinguish from misinformation. The public becomes overwhelmed by contradictory details and eventually stops trying to find the real answer. But why would the palace want to create that kind of confusion? Because whatever really happened is so damaging that even confusion and speculation are preferable to the truth coming out. As if summoned by their conversation, a new figure appeared across the street near the palace gates. Margaret recognized him immediately. Sir Reginald Thornfield, a former intelligence officer who had become a private security consultant, specializing in crisis management for high-profile clients. His presence at the palace grounds suggested that whatever was happening involved national security implications beyond simple royal family matters. Sarah gasped when she saw him. That's one of the men who came to the palace 3 days ago. He was part of the group that met with the Queen. Margaret felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in a disturbing pattern. A secret government meeting, followed by the disappearance of key palace staff, a mysterious death announcement without identifying the deceased, and now the presence of a former intelligence officer suggested something far more serious than a simple royal death. She pulled out her phone to photograph Sir Reginald, but he seemed to notice her attention. He looked directly at her across the street, and for a moment their eyes met. His expression was cold and calculating. And he pulled out his own phone, apparently making a call while continuing to stare in her direction. Margaret's phone buzzed with another text message. Final warning! Stop investigating or face consequences. The threatening message, combined with Sir Reginald's intimidating stare, made it clear that her investigation was making someone very nervous. But rather than discouraging her, the obvious attempts at intimidation only convinced her that she was getting close to something significant. Dr. Harwick noticed Margaret's pale expression after reading the text. "What's wrong? I think we've stumbled into something much bigger than a mysterious royal death. Someone is going to extraordinary lengths to keep this secret, and they're not using gentle persuasion." As evening approached, Margaret realized that traditional journalistic methods weren't going to uncover the truth behind this mystery. The normal sources were either missing, silenced, or providing deliberately confusing information. She needed to take a different approach. That night, she decided to focus on what she could verify independently, rather than relying on official sources. If everyone in the royal family was alive and well, as her investigations had suggested, then the funeral preparations at Westminster Abbey were for someone else entirely. But who could possibly warrant such an elaborate deception? Margaret spent the night piecing together every detail she had gathered, creating a timeline that revealed a pattern more disturbing than she had imagined. By morning, she had reached a conclusion that challenged everything she thought she knew about the royal family and British intelligence operations. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching historical precedents for secret royal protocols, she discovered a classified document that had been declassified the previous year, but received little media attention. The document outlined procedures for protecting monarchy stability during national security crises. According to the document, in extreme circumstances where a member of the royal family became involved in situations that could compromise national security, a protocol existed to create false public narratives while the real situation was managed privately. Margaret realized she had been asking the wrong question. Instead of who died, she should have been asking who needed to disappear. She called Sarah early in the morning, asking her to meet at a cafe far from the palace grounds. When Sarah arrived, she looked exhausted and frightened. "They know I've been talking to people," Sarah said immediately. "My supervisor called me into her office yesterday afternoon and asked if I had noticed any reporters asking staff members questions. She said there would be serious consequences for anyone who shared information about palace operations with outsiders." "Sarah, I need you to think carefully about something. In the past week, has anyone from the royal family seemed to disappear or become unavailable?" Sarah considered this question while stirring her coffee nervously. "Now that you mention it, I haven't seen Prince Andrew in over a week." "But that's not unusual. He often travels or stays at his other residences." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Prince Andrew had been involved in various controversies in recent years, and his activities were often kept deliberately low profile. "When was the last time you actually saw him at the palace?" "Maybe 10 days ago, but I don't usually see him regularly anyway." "What about his staff? His private secretary? His security detail?" Sarah's expression changed as she realized the significance of Margaret's questions. "His private secretary, Mr. Davidson, hasn't been in his office all week. The security office mentioned that Prince Andrew's protection detail had been reassigned to other duties." Margaret now had a theory that explained the mysterious Mourning announcement. But she needed confirmation from someone with access to information beyond what palace staff could provide. She decided to contact her most sensitive source, a former MI5 officer named Robert Sterling, who had maintained connections within British intelligence services even after his retirement. Robert had provided background information for several of her stories over the years, always with the understanding that their conversations were strictly off the record. "Robert, I need to ask you about something extremely sensitive," she said when he answered her call. "Margaret, before you say anything else, I should tell you that there's been chatter in intelligence circles about a journalist investigating palace activities. You should be very careful about what questions you're asking and who you're asking them to." That's exactly what I need to discuss with you. Have you heard anything about a national security situation involving a member of the royal family? Robert was quiet for several seconds before responding. I can't discuss specifics, but I will say this. Sometimes the most effective way to make someone disappear from public view is to convince the public they're dead. This confirmation of Margaret's theory sent chills down her spine. Are you saying the palace announced a death that didn't actually occur? I'm saying that in certain circumstances, intelligence services have protocols for managing public perception when reality becomes too complicated or dangerous to explain truthfully. How long would such a deception be maintained? That would depend on the nature of the situation being managed. If someone needed to disappear permanently, the deception would need to be permanent as well. Margaret hung up with the terrible realization that she might have uncovered a conspiracy that went to the very heart of the British establishment. But she still needed concrete evidence rather than theories and speculation. Her next step was to investigate the mysterious government officials who had visited the palace 3 days before the Mourning announcement. Using her contacts in various government departments, she began trying to identify who might have attended such a high-level meeting. Dr. Harwick called her with additional research that supported Margaret's developing theory. I've been reviewing historical cases where royal family members have effectively disappeared from public life, she said. There are actually several precedents, but they're usually explained as health issues, family disagreements, or voluntary retirement from public duties. But never a fake death? Not in modern times. However, during World War II, there were several cases where members of various European royal families were reported dead when they had actually been relocated for security reasons. Could the same thing be happening here? It's possible, but it would require an extraordinary level of coordination between the palace, the government, and intelligence services. Margaret decided she needed to take a risk that could either confirm her theory or end her career. She called the main switchboard at Buckingham Palace and asked to be connected to Prince Andrew's private office. I'm sorry, but His Royal Highness is not available for the foreseeable future, the operator responded. Can you tell me when he might be available for a brief interview? I'm not able to provide that information at this time. The carefully neutral responses suggested training in how to handle inquiries about Prince Andrew without providing any specific information about his whereabouts or availability. Margaret then called the offices of several charities and organizations that Prince Andrew regularly supported. In each case, she was told that his scheduled appearances had been postponed indefinitely due to unforeseen circumstances. The pattern was becoming clear. Prince Andrew had effectively vanished from all public activities, and his disappearance coincided exactly with the mysterious Mourning announcement. But Margaret needed to understand why such an extreme measure had been taken. What could Prince Andrew have done that required his complete disappearance from public life? She spent the afternoon researching recent international news events, looking for any situation that might have created a national security crisis involving a member of the royal family. Her search led her to reports about a complex international money laundering investigation that had been developing quietly for several months. According to news reports from various international sources, investigators had been following financial connections between offshore accounts and several high-profile individuals. The investigation involved multiple countries and appeared to be focused on activities that could be considered treasonous if they involved someone in a position of public trust. Margaret realized that if Prince Andrew had become involved in such an investigation, either as a target or as someone who possessed compromising information about other participants, his continued public presence could create impossible diplomatic and security complications for the British government. The fake death announcement would accomplish several objectives. It would remove him from public scrutiny, provide an explanation for his disappearance that would satisfy public curiosity, and allow intelligence services to manage whatever situation he had become involved in without public interference. But this theory raised an even more disturbing question. If Prince Andrew was alive but hidden away, who exactly was going to be buried at Westminster Abbey in 2 days? Margaret called Robert Sterling again, but this time his phone went straight to voicemail. Her attempts to reach other intelligence contacts met with similar results. The network of sources that had supported her journalism for years had suddenly become unavailable. That evening, she received a call from an unknown number. The voice was electronically distorted, making it impossible to identify the speaker. "Ms. Sullivan, you have been investigating matters that pose serious risks to national security. You have 48 hours to cease all activities related to palace affairs, destroy any materials you have gathered, and publish a retraction of any theories you may have developed." Who is this? Someone with the authority to ensure your cooperation. Failure to comply will result in consequences that extend far beyond your journalism career. The line went dead, leaving Margaret with a decision that would define the rest of her professional life. She could abandon the investigation and protect herself, or she could continue pursuing what might be the most significant story of her career, knowing that powerful people were prepared to take extreme measures to stop her. She looked out her hotel window at Westminster Abbey in the distance, where preparations continued for a funeral that might be the most elaborate deception in modern royal history. In less than 48 hours, someone would be buried there with all the ceremony befitting a member of the royal family, but the identity of that person remained a mystery that could expose corruption and conspiracy at the highest levels of British society. Margaret made her decision. She opened her laptop and began typing the story that would either establish her as one of Britain's most important investigative journalists or end her career completely. The palace had announced mourning for someone whose identity remained a mystery, but Margaret now understood that the real mystery wasn't who had died, but rather who had been made to disappear and why the British establishment was prepared to go to such extraordinary lengths to keep that secret hidden. As she wrote through the night, Margaret realized that tomorrow's funeral would be more than just a ceremony. It would be the final act in a deception that revealed how far the most powerful institutions in Britain were willing to go to protect their secrets. The deceased would remain a mystery, but the truth behind that mystery was about to be revealed to the world, regardless of the consequences for those who had tried so desperately to keep it hidden.